Someone who has knowledge that will help your best interest is our next guest here on 760 KFMB. Deborah Weiss, as mentioned, she's an attorney. She's an author and expert on Islamic stifling of free speech, Islamophobia being put out there by the left, and she is also a regular contributor to Front Page magazine. Deborah Weiss, thank you for just stepping aside slightly while we got Dave in there. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Lou.
Now, you're an expert. You have. I was reviewing you online. You have knowledge that it pales in comparison to anybody else when it comes to the knowledge of the Islamic State. Now, Obama says the Islamic State has, and I quote, perverted one of the world's great religions. This is today, end quote. Why is the West, and why especially Obama, so reluctant to acknowledge Muslim terrorism?
Wow. Well, we could be here for hours talking about that. There's a push in the West, especially in the liberal wing, to stifle all speech that's related to Islam, to criticize it, to acknowledge its darker aspects of it. It's really in the name of political correctness, and I think that in the case of Obama, it goes further than that. He seems to be a sympathizer to Islamists because if you look at his foreign policy, he has time after time after time sided with the Muslim Brotherhood, with the Iranian mullahs, with tyrannical regimes over freedom fighters over and over again.
And why doesn't the media call him out on this? This is something that bothers me. I know Obama has an affinity. He's a Muslim terrorist enabler. The only conclusion I can come to, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Deborah Weiss, is that the media has so much skin in the game because they didn't vet Obama. They threw their power behind him because, one, he's a Democrat, and two, he presented himself to be a black man, which he's not. He's biracial, 50% white, 50% black. Doesn't get more biracial than that. And now if they admit that they were wrong, they kind of have egg on their face, so they just keep going with the same charade. They pretend that that he's doing his job when he's not. I mean, the media, they're enablers and they're complicit, no?
Oh, they're absolutely enablers and complicit. And I think part of the reason for that, Lou, is unfortunately journalism isn't what it used to be. It used to be there for the purpose of reporting the news. Today, very few journalists even understand the news. They don't have the historical context for it. And a lot of them are actually liberal activists, and they think they go to journalism school to change the world, which is not supposed to be the function of a journalist. So part of it is a lack of knowledge. Part of it is political correctness. So, yeah, I agree with you. They're absolutely complicit.
Yeah, the news is dead. They're all from Fox News to CNN to MSNBC and alike. They're all propagandists, is what is. Joseph Goebbels would be proud because the news is all propaganda. But let's switch to, Brussels. We've got the latest terrorist attack yesterday, and we have Obama again saying that Islam has been perverted. No, in my opinion, Islam is terrorism. Islam is a cancer. It's a political organization. It is not a religion. We have Hillary Clinton not looking out, not commenting. She gives the words you have to say about the dead and the injured. But then her whole speech, the majority of it was focused on bigotry of the GOP, not catching and killing terrorists and preventing the next terrorist attack, saying we can beat them with technology. Deborah, I'm sure you're involved, social media and all that kind of stuff. All the young folks are today. You're not going to beat them with technology. You might get information from the technology, but the only way to get them is to kill them. We've got a president who has an affinity for Islam, refuses to acknowledge that Muslim terrorism exists, and then we have a woman who's running for president who's more concerned with political correctness and bigotry. How anybody could vote, I don't even know where you stand, who you're going to vote for. I'm not asking you, but how anybody could vote for these people is beyond me. What are people supposed to think when they look at Hillary Clinton and she's more concerned with bigotry than she is with Muslims killing people here in America?
Well, you're right, Lou, and it's not just Hillary. It's the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, this political correctness to the extreme where they don't want to acknowledge the threat of Islamic terrorism has been mainstreamed in the Democratic Party. I do want to make one comment that I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush and say it's all Muslims, because it isn't all people who identify themselves as Muslim. There are people who eschew the violent aspects of their own religion, and there is a spiritual component to their religion, but you are correct that it's not a religion in the way Western countries understand religion, like Judaism or Christianity, that it's largely political, and it does have a violent and very intolerant aspect of it, and it's not politically correct to say it. I think part of the reason for that is because it is couched as a religion, and we do have religious freedom, at least in America. Politicians are afraid to touch it. They don't want to criticize someone's religion. I think the key here, though, is to properly name it as, when it steps over that line into imposing their beliefs on us, whether it's through violence or other means, because they're doing it through other means, too. There are stealth groups who are trying to legislate it, pressure people, get them to stop saying things that would violate Islamic blasphemy laws. I think that when it crosses over that line to imposing their beliefs on non-Muslims, that the proper label for it would be a political ideology, and it should be addressed as an enemy ideology. So I think the political correctness has been mainstreamed in the Democrat Party, not just Hillary. If you remember, after the San Bernardino terrorist attack, which was also ISIS-inspired, the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, said that she was going to prosecute anybody who stated anti-Muslim rhetoric that edged toward violence. This is not the constitutional standard. She wound up backtracking because she got a lot of flack for it, but this is the whole mindset of the left. In fact, there's a bill right now that's not getting a lot of attention in Congress, H.R. 569, which was proposed by some Democrats in Congress to condemn anti-Muslim rhetoric. And the whole bill is so flawed. And right now, the last time I looked, we had about 133 Democrats co-sponsor the bill. There are only 188 Democrats in Congress. So this lets you know where their mindset is. And that bill will never get passed as long as there are Republicans in Congress. It probably won't even go to the floor for a vote. However, if the Democrats take control of the Congress, and if the Supreme Court seat winds up being filled with a liberal, all it will take is 5 Supreme Court justices to say that hate speech is not free speech, and then we won't be able to talk about that anymore, even though it would be an erroneous ruling.
Well, Deborah Weiss, hold that thought there. When we come back, we're going to talk about, I think Europe is gone. We're going to talk about the metastasizing of Muslim terrorism in Europe and Brussels, and how I feel that the cancer will spread to here. Deborah Weiss is our special guest. She is an expert on all things dealing with Muslim terrorism and the stifling of speech. We'll continue our conversation with her and the stifling of speech here on the Mike Slater Show, 760 KFMB. Welcome back to the Mike Slater Show. Lou Pate here with you on 760 KFMB. Our special guest is attorney Deborah Weiss. She's an expert on Islamic stifling of speech. She's a regular contributor to Front Page Magazine. And I left this out, Deborah. I apologize. She's the author of a recently published book titled The Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Jihad on Free Speech. I'll get that out there a few times, Deborah. Brussels, Molenbeek, the whole European continent. I'm going to go so far as to say the seeds of the Muslim cancer have been planted, and they are now growing. We see them in people in their 20s, like with Abdus Salam. Is Europe gone? Is it inevitable that it's just going to fall? I know friends of mine who have visited London, and I know friends of mine who are from London, and it's overrun with Arabs. And the same thing goes for a lot of other major cities in Europe. And as I've said earlier in the show, Deborah, you didn't hear, when they come to America, they have no interest in assimilating. They want it to be the Middle East in Europe. They want it to be the Middle East in America. So is Islam doing what Hitler couldn't do, and it's the fall of Europe, slow but sure?
Oh, my God. Well, I hope that all of Europe isn't lost yet, but it certainly seems that Belgium is, and all I can say is if the European Union political officials don't wake up soon, there's a very good chance that it will be. Brussels is at the heart of the EU. It was targeted because it's the capital of Belgium. There is a large Muslim community there that a lot of them travel back and forth from Iraq to Brussels, and it's believed that there's a lot of people there who have been giving aid and comfort to ISIS. They've been sheltering them, shielding them from law enforcement. As you probably know, the investigation has already uncovered another explosive, chemical weapons, and an ISIS flag. And there are more practicing Muslims in Brussels than there are practicing Christians. And in terms of just the numbers, it's expected that Muslims will be dominant in that city by 2030. There's actually a party of Islam in Belgium, if you can believe that, and 2 elected officials from that party have been elected in a democratic process, running on a platform of establishing an Islamic State. So I think that, there's a doctrine in national security called the enemy threat doctrine. And what it says is in order to win a war, you have to be able to identify the enemy, name it by name, you have to know who you are, and you have to know who they are. If you miss one of those, then you will lose the war. And that is what we're witnessing now. Under the rubric of Islamophobia, which the left likes to paint as bigotry, but it's often, they often label Islamophobic just true statements of fact. If you call, as you mentioned, Islamic terrorist groups, and you say they have anything to do with Islam. Now, you're not saying all Muslims or all this or all that, but even when you use qualifiers, like, say, radical Islam, which some people object to that qualifier, but even if you couch it with qualifiers, there's a large segment of the political elite that doesn't want to associate it. And what that means is if you can't identify the objectives and the motivational ideology for these attacks, you have a lot less of a chance of being able to identify it in their early stages. Because then you're treating it like thugs down the block, like it's just a crime, and you'll clean up the mess afterwards. But
like it's an isolated incident, as if it's an isolated incident.
Right, or a string of isolated incidents. That's also the thing with the lone wolf. It's just some guy, or it's post-traumatic stress, even though there was no trauma, or it's workplace unemployment. I mean, this is not what the problem is. We have to address the ideology. It's a true statement when the president says that we're not going to solve it just by killing them or shooting them, but it's a false statement when they try to say, like Marie Harf did, if you remember this from the State Department, that we need to get ISIS members jobs. I mean, that was a joke.
Well, Marie Harf is just the daughter of some connected rich guy, and she got up to stand up there with her blonde hair dye job and her smart girl glasses and really make herself look like an idiot. They ushered her over to the White House just to get rid of her because she was so stupid. But listen, Deborah, why though? I didn't mean to make it sound grandiose. Like has Europe fallen? Will Islam terrorism do what Hitler couldn't do? I didn't mean that to sound grandiose. I mean incrementally. I don't mean today. I don't mean tomorrow. I mean like over the next 50 to 75 to 100 years. It is so incremental what has taken place there. Like I said, a friend of mine who's from England, who planned to retire to England after working here in the States and making a good living, actually was going to go back and forth, 6 on, 6 off, has now decided not to.
Wow.
That he now doesn't want to go home as much as he loves his homeland. It's overrun.
Right.
It's overrun with hate.
Muslims also, first of all, the sheer numbers of the refugees they're bringing in are astronomical. A high percentage. First of all, they're calling them Muslim refugees from Syria. In truth, a lot of them aren't refugees. They're not fleeing persecution. They're economic migrants who are looking for opportunities, and a lot of them aren't even from Syria. They're coming from everywhere. They're coming from Pakistan, from Afghanistan. So it's a lie that these are all refugees. In America, we're not taking the Christians and the Yazidis, who really are persecuted. We're taking only the Muslims, even though Obama says we won't have a religious test. And as you probably know, Muslims tend to have more children than Christians, and certainly in Europe, where they're not even replacing themselves. So if you look at it from a demographic point of view, out 50 to 70 years, as you said, I hate to say it's over because it's not over till it's over. All I can say is we're at the precipice, and people better wake up because once freedom is lost, it's not going to come back.
And they want it, what they're doing in Europe, the way they're infesting Europe with their Muslim cancer, they want to do the same thing here.
Right.
Just so you know, Deborah, I don't issue disqualifiers because there is too much silence from the mainstream Muslim community here in America when it comes to honor killings, when it comes to all of the atrocities committed by Muslims around the world. There's just too much silence there, and to me, that means you're condoning it. But let me ask you this quickly before we go. Hey, we're going to go into the bottom of the hour.
Silence can be construed as assent. I agree.
Okay, we're going to go to the bottom of the hour. I stole a few minutes from you at the top. Can you hang through the break and stay a little longer? I gave some time to a caller before. Can you hang
fine.
after the break?
Sure.
Okay. Now, but just one last question here is the Syrian issue. Why is it that the press doesn't acknowledge all the horrendous crimes, rape and molestations and everything else they're doing there? The press is, I'm a member of the media, I know this. I know people in TV, they are purposely turning a blind eye to what the Muslim refugees, the Syrian refugees are doing once they get to Europe.
Yeah, really, it's just the same thing. It's political correctness. Sometimes it just doesn't fit their narrative. I will say that the far left and Islamists have it's called an unholy alliance. When the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and even though you would think that feminists and gays and people who are supposed to believe in freedom, human rights would be enemies of a totalitarian ideology, in truth, a lot of these leftists really want their will imposed through big government in the form of extreme socialism, maybe even communism. And so they have formed an alliance, and the main goal is to undermine Western freedom, and they're doing a good job of it.
All right, well, hold that thought. Deborah Weiss, she is our special guest. She is an attorney. She's an expert on Islam. As you can hear, we're going to continue on with our conversation with Deborah after the bottom of the hour. And we'll talk with you if you want to get in on the conversation. 800-760 KFMB. This is the Mike Slater Show with Lou Pate on 760 KFMB. Welcome back to the Mike Slater Show, 760 KFMB. Lou Pate sitting in with our special guest, Deborah Weiss. She's an attorney and the author of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Jihad on Free Speech. I'm basically an expert on all things dealing with the Islamic State and everything that goes along with it. Deborah, you heard there in the news that President Obama says, and I'm paraphrasing, that defeating ISIS is one of his top priorities, although he's got a lot on his plate. I guess staying alive is number one priority on my plate. Yet he is providing an avenue for them to come into the country through the form of Syrian refugees, through the form of not enforcing federal immigration laws, to the form of opening up relations with Cuba, and so on and so forth down the line. He's providing so many avenues for terrorists to get into this country and kill Americans, yet he says defeating ISIS is a priority. Those words ring hollow to me from a man who's been lying to us for 7 years about it.
You're right, Lou. Talk is cheap. ISIS has openly admitted that part of its strategy to infiltrate the West is by slipping in some of its ISIS fighters in with the quote-unquote Muslim refugees. And yet, we don't have any way of vetting them at this point. There is no database that tells you, oh, this Muslim is really a victim and this Muslim is an ISIS fighter. So there's not anything that we can check against. Right at this moment, it's not possible to properly vet them. And as I said before, this administration is letting in the Muslims and very, very few Christians, which we know are being targeted in a genocide. Thank God they finally admitted it's a genocide. But
John Kerry had to be dragged kicking and screaming to make that statement.
Right. That's very true. And now, you know what? I'm sorry, but I forgot your question already.
No, that's okay. There's a lot of information, and I'm sure the KFMB listeners are enjoying your wealth of information. Basically, I said Obama says his priority is to defeat ISIS.
Oh,
yet
the policies.
He's providing avenues for them to get into the country.
Right, and in fact, right now, America is slated to take in 10,000 Syrian refugees. We've already taken in refugees under other circumstances, not Syrian, but, for example, Somalian And in the states like Missouri or Mississippi, I'm getting mixed up, Minnesota, I'm sorry, I'm really tired. But they're causing all kinds of problems over there. They're not assimilating. They're filing all kinds of lawsuits. They don't want to drive the cabs with with blind people because of the seeing eye dogs, and they don't want a dog in the car, and they don't want to bring people from the airport because of the alcohol they might bring. So we're already letting in people, and it's already a problem. And I'll say, you know what? Just last night I was listening to RTTV. Don't ask me why, but because it's a propaganda station. It's a propaganda station, but already they're trying to say that Western policies and Republicans in particular are already ramping up their, quote, Islamophobic policies. So you see, Lou, it isn't just speech that's Islamophobic now. It's actual policies. And which policies are Islamophobic? The policies that are designed to protect our national security. As you said, the borders, is addressing terrorism. We can't do any of that for fear of being, quote, unquote, Islamic. So I think it's very important for your audience to understand what that word means, and that it doesn't mean the same thing to you as it does when they say it. When, people here might automatically assume that it's bigotry akin to racism and sexism, and nobody wants to be a bigot, right? But when Muslim organizations, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Council on American Islamic Relations, when they say it, what they're talking about is anything that sheds Islam in a negative light, even when it's true, and I would argue, especially when it's true.
Now, I throw this out because this is just breaking as we're on the air, Deborah. You have, as I mentioned earlier, Hillary Clinton addresses the terrorist attack in Brussels, and her thing is to target GOP, and I quote, bigotry. I just look at the TV and I see Trump says, and I don't know if you're a Trump supporter or not, it doesn't matter. As a question following up here, Trump says, I would be willing to use nuclear weapons against ISIS. Now, and the American people look at this. They say, oh, this one's politically correct. She's worried about people getting their feelings hurt. And this guy says, I want to kill in great numbers the people who want to kill us. I mean, to me, it's no question which way people should go. I mean, as far as whether you're going to vote Republican or Democrat. But don't let that fool you either, though. I'm not talking about Trump, Deborah. Paul Ryan and the Republicans are in bed with the Democrats. A lot of people don't realize, because a lot of the minutia of public policy gets lost in the sauce, when they're arguing about whose wife is prettier and who's naked and who's not, that a lot of people don't realize, I cited this earlier, that Paul Ryan approved the omnibus spending on December 15th of 2015, just before Christmas. They like to drop these things in between Hanukkah and Christmas. They like to squeeze these things in. They did it with Obamacare, and everything in the omnibus spending bill gives Obama everything he wants, including funding to bring in Syrian refugees. Yeah,
and a lot of the Christian groups, some of the Catholic charities are also getting paid, and that's why they're propagating this. I don't want to comment specific on nuclear. That wouldn't be my area. Whomever winds up being president would need the advice of national security experts to know if boots on the ground or something else. You don't want to do something that'll endanger us, and I don't know the answer to that. But what I can say is that Hillary Clinton and the left, and I'm okay to say it's the left because it is at this point. I used to try to be nonpartisan when I did this work, Lou. When I started out, I tried to be pretty nonpartisan, and I painted with an even brush, but at this point, you just can't. I mean, the evidence is so stark, so in your face. This administration, whether it's the foreign policies, whether it's the domestic legislation that the Democrats are proposing, or as you correctly pointed out, the candidates that are running for office, they just don't want to admit that there's a problem, even when it's with violent terrorism, because they're pandering to their constituents. And truth be told, I think that part of what she's doing is trying to get more voters by letting in those who are hostile to America's ideals and freedom. Who do you think they're going to vote for? They're not going to vote for a Republican if they become citizens here. Who do you think the illegal immigrants are going to vote for if we give them amnesty? They're all going to be Democrat voters. If you don't mind me telling you a quick story, I used to be a counsel. I was a lawyer on a congressional committee. This is years ago, before 9/11, and before we knew about all these problems. However, we did investigations when there were contested elections, and what we found, this is in the late 1990s, was there was a lot of fraud. And people who were dead were voting. People who were voting in multiple cities. Dogs were voting. So we thought, well, you don't want your vote diluted. What can you do about it? And we proposed a bill to require voter ID. This is before the Real ID Act. And I expected the left to say no. I expected there to be partisan division on it. But when I woke up the next morning and saw in the paper, it wasn't yes or no on the policy. It said, Republicans are racist against Hispanics. They hate Hispanics, and that's how the whole thing got painted in the media, and it was over before it started. And now your vote doesn't count because every time you legally vote, you'll have 2 or 3 illegal people voting and not get caught. So crying Islamophobia, crying bigotry, crying all kinds of names like that is, on one hand, just a way to shut down the discussion when they cannot win the argument on the merits, and by having policies that allow illegals to become citizens is another way for them to get votes, because that's what's important, Lou. What's important is that they get votes and get their job, not that we retain our freedom and our national security.
And get to stay alive. Deborah, final question before we let you go. I appreciate the generosity of your time. I know I stole a few minutes from you at the top
Thank
there.
you.
We have Syrian refugees, which you've talked about, which you said we could talk about for hours, going in and flooding Europe. There's not enough work in Europe and Greece for the people that live there. You see, Greece is bankrupt. And now you look here at the United States, what's the unemployment rate now? 5.9, 4.9, whatever it is. It's a made-up number. The unemployment rate is actually somewhere up around 23%. Unemployment is up in the black community, although Barack Obama was going to be the savior. Actually, the numbers for everybody across the board are worse when it comes to employment. And now Obama is going to bring in many more refugees from the Middle East, many more refugees from Europe, mostly Muslim, probably over 90% Muslim, when like in Europe, there's not enough jobs here in the United States for American workers, let alone all of these illegals coming in from the Middle East. We have to handle our illegals coming in from Mexico first. So, I mean, where does it end? When does Obama and the left start looking out for the American people? When do the Republicans start looking out for the American people? My answer is they don't, hence the rise of people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. What do you think?
I'm not sure Bernie Sanders is. I don't want to comment on specifics.
Hold on. Bernie's not looking out for us, but he's rising. He's rising because of that.
Well, when the millennials, there's no question.
Well, hold on. When the millennials find out he wants them to share their weed, they'll abandon him.
Right. There's no question that people are fed up with the system. I'm not sure that our political system is working anymore. I personally am completely fed up. I will say that the left is much worse, as bad as the right is. Whomever you pick on the right, as bad as they are, the left is much worse. And the final point I will mention is that as ISIS rises and as the influx of Muslim refugees increases, the efforts to clamp down on this speech and the accompanying policies that they deem Islamophobic is also going to rise. So I think we're coming to a boiling point. You have to pick a side. On one, and you see it in the riots during the Trump speeches. You're going to have the calling him Hitler, calling him Nazi.
Well, that's all distracting. I say this, Deborah.
That's focusing on helping the Islamists, and the other side that wants to counter it. And the problem is not a lack of jobs, and it's not bigotry. The problem is Islamist ideology and the politically correct refusal to acknowledge its existence.
I couldn't have said it better. I say pick a side, live or die. Deborah Weiss, the author of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Jihad on Free Speech, an attorney and expert on all things to do with the Islam cancer that is spreading around the world. Deborah Weiss, thank you for your extended time here today. We appreciate it. Hope you can come back sometime.
Thank you so much for having me, Lou.